Welcome to the 8th edition of Bildrausch Filmfest Basel. It's a huge privilege to welcome you to Paul Schrader's lecture on Rethinking Transcendental Style. In 1972, Paul Schrader, being a young film critic at the time, wrote as his master thesis at the UCLA a book called Transcendental Style in Film. He wrote about cinema's capacity, especially the cinema of Ozu, Bresson and Dreyer, to capture what is actually invisible to the eye, the divine, the transcendental. Transcendental Style in Film has become a true classic. A seminal book that still influences students and scholars to this very day. But rather than citing any reviews on the book, I'd like to tell you a very short anecdote to underline my words. I recently spoke to a couple of young people about the lecture you're going to hear right now. One has studied film, one film history, and both are in the 20s and both have read the book. And one told me, oh, this is such a moving book, and the other one told me, this is such a beautiful book. And I think what more could you want from a book on film theory that after almost 50 years, scholars are not only intellectually challenged and engaged, but that they are moved by the beauty of its author's thoughts. Last week, a re-edition of this book has been published with a new 35-page foreword by Paul Schrader. It tells a lot about this cinephile that after 45 years, while shooting and completing his new masterpiece, First Reformed, he felt the urge to revisit his earlier series and conclusions and re-examine them. And once again, he proves that he's an original thinker, a brilliant thinker, an idiosyncratic one. And yes, very beautiful foreword. So today we have really something to look forward to. Actually, we have ordered this book. Well, it's not this book, that's a pre-edition, but we had ordered a lot of these books so that you could buy them and hopefully have them signed by Paul, but they never have been shipped. Sorry. That has a very good reason. There's not one book left in the stock. After 1 week, they're totally sold out. That's quite a pity for us, but I would suggest it's quite a success for the book. Well, what will happen now? First, Paul Schrader will take the floor to elaborate on his writings on transcendental style in film. And following this, Johannes Binotto will engage in a conversation on the topic. Let me briefly introduce Johannes Binotto to you. Johannes Binotto teaches cultural and media studies at the universities of Zurich and the film school in Lucerne. He is also an editor at the film magazine Filmbulletin, and he's known for his research on the uncanny and on connections between film, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Paul Schrader. It's an enormous joy and honor to have you here, Paul. Please, a very warm welcome.
Those of you who have seen me here over the last couple of days probably are aware that I'm having some vision problems. And I can't see out of this eye, it's full of blood. So I'm going to read this speech, but I may be a little more deliberate than I would normally be. Just don't want to get lost. So 50 years ago, I graduated from Calvin College in Western Michigan. It was a religious college. And I headed off to UCLA Film School. The 60s had come in like a howling wind and carried me off. I transferred my interest in theological matters into a love of cinema, specifically the European cinema of the 60s. I had a lot of catching up to do, The Christian Reformed Church of my denomination, their position on film attendance was restrictive when I was raised, and I hadn't seen many films. In Los Angeles, I became a movie buff and a film critic, and I saw movies constantly. But I remained curious. Was there a connection between the world I was living in and the world I had come from? In certain films, I sensed a link between past and present, between a sacred past and a profane present, between the life of the soul and the commercial life of the cinema. But this link was a link of style, not a link of content. This was the insight I had. It's an insight that others have had before me. Spirituality in art is about the how and not the what. The form reveals the content. Content is crucial, of course, but it is defined by the form. So at the age of 24, I wrote Transcendental Style in Film. I realized I was too young to write it at the time, but I also realized that if I didn't write it then, I never would. I could feel my theological knowledge vanishing, and also I realized in another year I wasn't going to be willing to spend a year writing a book for nothing. And so I took the plunge. In Transcendental Style, I proposed, in that book was informed by the films of Ozu and Bresson and Dreyer. Their films, it seemed to me, had used similar techniques to draw the viewer into contact with the ineffable or the invisible, or what Otto called the holy other. These techniques were, to varying degrees, withholding techniques. They held elements away from the viewer, elements that the viewer expects. The viewer gets less. The essence of motion pictures is action and empathy. Photographs create empathy. You see an image of a place or a person, and you empathize. And then those images move. Action and empathy are the great commercial engines of motion pictures. They are the source of their appeal. In the place of action, Transcendental Style offers delayed action, sometimes inaction. Characters tend to speak slowly and walk slowly. There are pauses. There are lengthy tableaus where nothing seems to happen. Excessively long camera takes. Take, for example, the delayed cut. Normally, when editing a film, a cut is made on action. So if someone enters the room, the splice is on the door opening. If they leave the room, the splice is on the door closing. The delayed cut creates dead time. So someone exits the room, the door closes. 1, 2, 3, then you cut. And this is not something that your eye normally does. If someone walks out of a room, you don't stay there and keep looking at the door. But now a filmmaker is starting to do this. The Transcendental Style also retards, beside retarding action, retards empathy. It uses flat expressions, emotionless performances, often by non-actors. In conventional films, dramatic scenes are edited to enhance empathy. See the dog, see the boy watching the dog, back to the dog, back to the boy. In contrast, Transcendental Style has longer takes and fewer cuts. Sometimes scenes are played in a single master angle. There are no editorial winks or nudges. The viewer isn't being instructed by the editorial cuts. There may perhaps be, 2 characters on screen, one screen right, one screen left, and there is no edit. So the viewer has to start deciding what is more interesting to me at this moment, the character who is talking or the character who is listening, and the viewer starts to make his own edits. The same thing is true with music. Underscoring is the simplest, most effective way to dictate, manipulate emotion. It tells you how to feel happy, sad, scared, and so forth. In films of spiritual style or contemplative style, there is often no musical underscoring, only sound effects. You are not being told how to feel at this moment. No musical guideposts. Or conversely, it might be used unexpectedly, such as in Ozu, where no music for an emotional scene, but suddenly there's a shot of a vase or a mountain, and there's an explosion of Western music. Why would filmmakers work against the very qualities that make movies unique and successful? I'm sure a lot of financiers have asked that. Because, such filmmakers have a different agenda. They don't seek solely to entertain, divert, and amuse. They want to take viewers to another place, a place that's very hard to access. They want to bring the viewers closer to the non-material world, to the mystery itself. To do this, transcendental style must take a lean-back approach. Most films lean into the viewer. Movies are desperate for love, desperate for attention. They will grab you by the lapel. They will hold you tight. They show you pictures of beautiful people and fast cars and explosions. And it will play music to instruct you how to feel every single moment. That's how desperate they are. Contemplative films, on the other hand, lean away from the viewer. They challenge the viewer to lean forward, to become part of the film's journey, to be active rather than reactive. It is a kind of passive-aggressive manipulation rather than an aggressive manipulation. Transcendental style then doesn't rely on intellect or emotion. You can't think your way into the world of the soul. And emotions, won't get you there either. Spiritual style in art is much closer to meditation, to find that quiet place where the holy resides. Good things happen while you wait. Transcendental style is then a process, a liturgy, a towel, a way. An artist cannot bring a viewer into the presence of the mystery by catering to the viewer's desire for movement. It doesn't work that way. There is no such thing as fast meditation, and there's no such thing as fast transcendental style. When a film leans away from a viewer, the viewer can do one of two things. He or she can get up and leave the theater, and many often do, or they can start to lean forward. And when they start to lean forward, you have a new kind of chemistry going on between the seer and the seen. Is it possible for a film to lean back too much? Of course. At what point does boredom in film cease to be an aesthetic tool and become plain old boredom? Well, that's the delicate dance of transcendental style. To use boredom as a scalpel, it needs to be used precisely. I'd like to digress and say a word about faith-based films. They have been in the news lately, particularly in the United States. These are, films of the Is God Dead genre. I don't know if I'm sure they get seen and made here too. I don't see much difference between faith-based films and commercial cinema. Faith-based films use the same tools, action and empathy, as routine Hollywood melodramas. The techniques that make one fall in love with Reese Witherspoon or be stirred by Tom Cruise or hate the villain or like the villain. They're all the same. It doesn't matter. I could make a film that said Adolf Hitler is Satan. I could make a film that said Adolf Hitler is God. I would use the same techniques in both films, and they would both work exactly the same way. So I don't think that makes one more authentic than the other. Hollywood tricks in God's name are just Hollywood tricks. Inserting Jesus into a commercial formula isn't the same thing as making a spiritual film. So I wrote that book. University of California published it, and my life took another direction. I became involved in screenwriting and directing. I liked spiritual films. I had written about them, but had no interest in making one myself. I was too intoxicated by action and empathy, sex and violence. Occasionally someone would attempt to connect my films with that book, and I would say, no, that's not me. You'll never catch me on that thin Bressonian ice. Then 3 years ago, I was invited to observe a panel at the SCMS, the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, yearly convention in Atlanta. The panel was called Rethinking Transcendental Style, and 3 film scholars from Texas, from Israel, and Portugal gave reappraisals of that 45-year-old book. And I sat and listened to these, and it came to mind that I thought, if anyone is rethinking that book, it should be me, not them. So I started rethinking. And the result was an essay that is included in the updated version of the film, recently published, again by UCal Press. So what did happen to Transcendental Style? Where did my rethinking lead me? Well, first, Gilles Deleuze happened. Second, Andrei Tarkovsky happened. And third, slow cinema happened. What I didn't realize in 1972 was that what I was calling Transcendental Style was actually an outgrowth of post-war neorealism. This was the insight that French philosopher Gilles Deleuze brought 10 years later with his 2 cinema books, Movement Image in 1984 and Time Image in 1986. Deleuze divided film history into 2 periods. Movement Image, which was defined by how objects moved on screen, and Time Image, which was defined by the amount of time one watches those objects. For Deleuze, World War II was the dividing line. After the war, with the rise of Italian neorealism, Deleuze detected a shift away from the importance of movement and to the importance of time. Now, I'm not well versed in Deleuze, and I'm a little over my head here, certainly not as well as Johann. But I think it's hard to deny that beginning in the late 1940s, certain narrative films began to slow their pace and linger over their images. Both André Bazin and Gilles Deleuze point to the very same scene, they discuss it at length, as the beginning point of that shift. And it's a scene from Vittorio De Sica's Umberto D. In that scene, a maid, a minor character, rises in the morning from her small bedroom, goes into the kitchen, goes to light the stove. She takes a stick match, strikes it against the wall, and it doesn't light. So she strikes it a second time, and now it lights. She puts it to the stove, turns on the gas, and the match goes out. So she has to turn off the gas. Has to pick up another match, strike it on the wall, back to the stove, turn on the gas, light the stove. This time it lights, she sets the match down. What De Sica has just done has shifted the center of gravity of the scene. The scene becomes not about the movement of striking the match or lighting the stove, but about the time spent watching someone lighting a stove. And that was the critical distinction that he realized. And Robert Bresson was one of the first directors to realize that this unnecessary protraction of time, holding on to an image longer than the viewer expects, had a phenomenological effect. The viewer becomes aware of watching something over time. This is what philosopher Nuri Bilge Ceylan had called la durée, the duration of the experience. Duration changes the relationship between the seer and the scene. Let's go back to the example of the delayed cut. Bresson's character in Pickpocket exits the room. The door closes, and he lingers on the door before cutting. 2-3 seconds. What is happening during these 2-3 seconds? It is something. It's not nothing. Something is happening, but it's not about that door. It's about the time you spend watching the door. And in so doing, Bresson starts using time as a technique to change your perception of these events. So what if he holds on the door for 10 seconds? Then what happens? What if he holds on the door for 30 seconds? Then what happens? Duration. And critical post-war directors realized this and started using it. Bresson, Ozu, Rossellini were using duration to create meditative cinema. Mizoguchi and Antonioni were using it to create contemplative cinema. Let me give you a hypothetical example of how duration works, an exaggerated one. Let us imagine a pastoral scene. Let's imagine a grassy hill, clouds in the distance, small herd of goats, could be right here in Switzerland, all in a locked-off frame. Then a man appears on the upper right-hand corner of the screen, and he starts walking down a diagonal path across the screen. Now, anyone who has watched slow cinema knows that that director is not going to cut till that man walks ever so slowly across the entire screen and then exits. And then he may not cut then. He may even wait a little longer. So your mind begins to wander. You look at the goats. There are 5 of them. You listen to the sound of the wind, the trees. It's awfully loud. You watch the shape of the clouds. You hear a distant sound of children and an automobile engine. It's a school bus. A school bus is coming. It's going to enter the frame. Is it going to enter from the right? Is it going to enter from the left? It drives away. It's not coming. Oh, there are only 4 goats now. One of them must have walked away while I was waiting for the school bus. The man is halfway now across the screen, but the sky seems much darker. Is a storm coming? And what's that sound? Is the school bus coming back? Well, what's going on here? You, the viewer, are watching a movie, but you are also creating one. You are being forced by duration to invest yourself in the storyline. Therefore, you have become an active viewer rather than a passive viewer. You are leaning forward. You are leaning into the film. At the same time, Deleuze was formulating his theory of durational cinema, time image. A Russian director, Andrei Tarkovsky, was putting it into practice. Influenced by Bresson, Tarkovsky brought withholding devices to the large canvas, encompassing science fiction, dreams, memory, history, metaphysics, and poetic realism. Ozu's theme was the family, Bresson's was the individual, Tarkovsky's theme was time itself. Although Tarkovsky used the elements of transcendental style, he was not a purist. He had religious themes, obsessions, and characters. He was austere. He employed these distancing devices. I'm not going to list them now, but maybe later we can talk specifically about what these distancing devices are. There's about 8 or 10 of them. But his intent was slightly different. A transcendental guide or guru or film director self-effacingly seeks to escort his respondent to another level of consciousness. Tarkovsky was more interested in passing through the portal himself than in escorting the viewer. This seems to be clear from his 1984 film Nostalgia. At the end of that film, Dominic, a deranged mystic, immolates himself, sets himself on fire. In response, Andrei, the film's protagonist and Tarkovsky's surrogate, fulfills the promise to Dominic to carry a lit candle across the waters of a shallow mineral pool. The pool is empty, but Andrei struggles against the wind, against his own failing health to complete his task. Foot by foot, second by second, all the way. He finally reaches his goal. He places the flickering candle on the stone ledge, falls off screen, and dies. That shot, the camera holds on the candle. That shot, the candle, is the Bressonian ending. It's the same as the last shot of Diary of a Country Priest, which was a crucifix after the priest had fallen out of frame. It's the same as the last shot of Trial of Joan of Arc, which is the burnt stake. But it's not the last shot of Nostalgia. Tarkovsky then switches to black and white and shows a shot of Andrei sitting outside his ancestral home by a pond with his dog. And then the camera slowly pulls back, and as snow falls, it is revealed that that entire tableau of the home is in fact in the middle of a ruined cathedral. The subject of the film is not the candle, is not the icon. The subject of the film is memory. It is specifically Tarkovsky's memory. Tarkovsky's films mark a dividing point in the history of durational cinema. Before Tarkovsky, the use of withholding and distancing devices, what Deleuze called time image, took place in the context of theatrical cinema. Transcendental style falls into this category. After Tarkovsky, these devices became increasingly exaggerated and started to fall into the domain of film festivals and art museums. The 3-second Bresson shot of a door became a 10-minute static view of traffic in Taiwan. Transcendental style was now morphing into that hydra-headed monster we call slow cinema. Without going into it at length, I'll simply say that slow cinema refers to films of considerable length where very little happens. Béla Tarr's Satan Tango, for example, runs 7 hours. The opening shot is of cows wandering in a farm courtyard, and that lasts for 7.5 minutes. That's why I say these films lie outside the purview of commercial cinema. Cinema, in my opinion, is inherently narrative. When a photographed image occurs over time, that's narrative. When two images are conjoined, that's narrative. Film, throughout its history, has become more and more complex in its telling of narrative. However, what happens when it becomes less complex? What happens when it dissembles and goes the other direction from the complexity of the story to the staticness of the story? What happens when movement image becomes time image? What happens when action becomes duration? These are the questions raised by slow cinema. It seems to me that as movies move away from their narrative essence, their nucleus, they vector like errant electrons in one of 3 general directions. And all of these directions end in a dead point, in a conceptual dead point. one of which is the surveillance camera, the unending view of reality. Another is the art gallery, the abstraction of shape and sound. And the third is the mandala, which is the fixed image suitable for meditation. I'll just talk about the dead point of the surveillance camera. In 1952, the maid in Umberto D struck her match 3 times. Three times for about 10 seconds. In 1975, the title character of Chantal Ackerman's Jean Dielman spent 30 minutes at a stretch doing household tasks. By 2009, the maid and Dielman had morphed into the family members of Joan Lu's Oxide 2, who prepare and eat dumplings over the course of her 132-minute 9-shot film. The next stop of that progression is the surveillance camera. It's just, we'll set it up outside, and you can stay here and you watch it for the rest of your life. And I'm sure they've done it in a gallery somewhere already. The tendency then reaches this conceptual endpoint. The art gallery tendency becomes the light patterns of James Turrell, and the mandala tendency, the spiritual tendency, becomes the mandala, the icon, the candle. What defines these 3 vectors is their origin in narrative movement image and their endpoint in conceptual essence, and the fact that at some point all pass through the Tarkovsky ring. The Tarkovsky ring is a celestial marker that separates commercial cinema from museum cinema. He was right on the edge of it himself. So in closing, I return. Oh, thank you. In closing, I return to the question with which I began. What happened to transcendental style? It's still there. Transcendental style is still being used. The transcendental style is, of course, well within the Tarkovsky ring. It's actually rather close to the nucleus of narrative itself. It's just off a bit. And that's where you'll find Bresson and Rossellini and Mizoguchi hanging out. It is a style designed for audiences, not academics. Smaller audiences, but audiences nonetheless. These films may use duration. They may employ boredom as an aesthetic tool, but it is in service of a popular audience, not in service of itself. In recent years, I would describe Alexander Sokharov's Mother and Son, Carlos Regado's Silent Light, Bruno Dumont's Haydovich, Jessica Hauser's Lords, Pavel Pavlovsky's Ida, Diedrich Brueggemann's Stations of the Cross, and Eugene Green's Sapienza as films which use or employ the techniques of transcendental style. And so that is where my thinking took me, and I elaborated a little more on that in the book. Thank you.
You've already teased us with that you said maybe in the discussion we could talk more about the specifics of what you call withholding techniques, maybe with some examples, or what you find particularly striking about them.
There's a buffet of techniques that contemplated. There's a buffet of techniques that contemplative directors eat from, and no 2 directors uses the same elements in the same proportion. So it's not they're all making different films, but the techniques are relatively constant. The first and most important one is the extended static shot. The lack of camera movement, the lack of pan, and the lack of tilt. Now, a variation of that, say, would be Béla Tarr, who would have an extremely slow lateral dolly, which has almost the effect of a static shot, but it's not a static shot itself. Another thing they do is they tend to withhold edits, so you wait a little longer to go in for the coverage, or you don't ever go in for the coverage. So you're sitting there and you're holding on the shot of 2 people or 3 people, and the viewer is waiting for the coverage, waiting for the over-the-shoulder, waiting for the single. And it's not there. And then the viewer is thrown off. And maybe it does come. Like in the film I just did, one scene I brought it in right at the end, and another scene I didn't bring in the coverage at all. So now I'm playing with that tool. The other third one is, the lack of music. What happens when you're not told how to feel? In First Reformed, the Ethan Hawke character comes across a dead body. Now, normally, you wouldn't have to worry about how he feels because the music would tell you exactly. He would be either frightened, or he would be anxious, or he would be panicky. But there's no music. It's just the sound of the trees. So you have to figure out how he actually feels. So that's another withholding device. The delayed cut, which we mentioned, not cutting on action, but holding back, that's a withholding device. Planimetric composition, where everything seems to be on the same plane, rather than two-dimensional, three-dimensional. That's withholding device because foreground and background normally in cinema tell you how to feel about things. And if everything is on the same plane, you're not being instructed as to what is more important. Similarly, center punching is another technique. Normally on a horizontal screen, if you have a head, it's put to the right or the left. When you constantly have everybody center punched, right square in the center, in the crosshairs, you are creating a kind of unease because you're not instructing the viewer in a narrative they're used to knowing. Similarly, it's the same thing with center punching when you stop doing over the shoulders. You're also throwing them off. 1, by using planimetric composition, and 2, by not indicating spatial relationships. See, what else can they do? They use heightened sound effects. And that often, the footsteps are always too loud, and the key in the door is always too loud. That's another withholding device. The actual size of the frame can be, like in EDA, the 1:37 framing size, you're given less of a screen. A black and white can be a withholding device. Lack of certain kinds of color. Lack of decor. What happens when people are in a room and there's nothing in the room? Usually you're used to figuring out people's emotional, physical relationships by the space they're in. What if the space tells you nothing? So these are all withholding devices, and you can't use them all. But everyone dips into that buffet and comes away with a unique kind of, Chinese plate of goodies.
But I think what is also obvious with these examples, and I think with the very word of withholding, that in a sense it only works if you have like a surrounding in which it is still experienced as something that is different from what you would normally have.
That's the trick. I mean, how do you withhold and not drive people out of the theater? Well, you make them uneasy, and you have to somehow convince them that their unease is worth the wait, that something is going to happen, and that if they leave, they're always going to wonder what happened. And that's kind of the trick. And some directors do it better than others, I once saw Béla Tarr spoke after a film, and the first thing he said to the audience was, "Why are you all still here? You should have all left by now." But when he was good, he had the gift of making you think, "I need to stay." And what can that be? That can be some kind of tension, some kind of unresolved issue, and it can be a central character, like in Bresson. It can be a romantic configuration, like in Antonioni, or it can be a family configuration, like in Ozu. But there's something that you say, "I need to see where this is going."
So we could. So
that's the push-pull. That's the passive-aggressive. The aggressive is you're showing them something they want to see. The passive is you're pulling it away from them.
Mm-hmm. So could one argue that like one of the problems or possible dead ends of slow cinema is that if you just make it slower, you would lose, because what you're describing is actually more aptly described with dynamics, that it is about like a change of pace in which moments of what you call moments of stasis will have an impact.
Yes. I assume if you're all cinemaphiles, you have walked out of a slow movie at some point in your life. And if you don't, I have some tickets I want to sell you. At some point, it's just not working, and you realize that the film director is being perverse in the way an artist can be perverse and just doing something for the sake of doing it. And the element of communication is not what it should be. And those pieces are quite like installations in a gallery, where they're not locked into time. In a gallery, you can go look at it for a minute or two, walk over and look at something else, then come back to it and look at it some more. You can't do that in a movie. So once you walk out, you're out. And so that's why it works better in a gallery than it does in a cinema.
I was also wondering about, because I was familiar with the example of the one that Deleuze actually picks from Bazin, from Umberto De. Now, when one revisits this film and sees this scene, one is also kind of one is surprised that they were so surprised about that scene, because looking at it today, it does not seem that slow, that much of a delay. And I find it interesting that, because you also showed us how kind of like these withholding techniques in slow cinema, it gets slower and slower, whereas at the same time we have in commercial cinema, in action films, we have a greater and greater pace.
Yeah, an acceleration of cuts. They estimate that the number of splices in a film doubles about every 15 years. What De Sica is really withholding, is the edit. When you see something that long, you are expecting to see her face, you're expecting to see the stove, you're expecting to see the match, and that's the thing that probably Bazin and Deleuze struck them is, why are there no splices here? And that was the notion of time, of duration.
I was also kind of because I've read your this new chapter. I mean, it's certainly not just a new introduction to the book, but it's really a new chapter that you've opened. But I also find it interesting that I almost have a feeling of like with the example of Tarkovsky and particularly Nostalgia, you kind of hold a certain grudge with him for this last shot of Nostalgia. Could you elaborate more on that? What particularly rubs you the wrong way?
Well, it's this idea that I'm going to set up this rigorous liturgy, and at the end of this liturgy, you will come face to face with a mystery, and then we get to the end of the mystery, and he says, "Oh, I want to go first." So that's my grudge.
And maybe you could also elaborate more on that, because I think that's also for you like that's a crucial distinction between just like a certainly a cinema of contemplation, a cinema of meditation, but not necessarily a cinema or a transcendental style cinema.
Yeah, I mean, now we're getting into the fuzzy world of definitions, and at that point, the devil can quote scripture, that it's really hard to, make them was kind of precise. It's better to one of the nice things about slow cinema, the term, is that it's a sort of catch-all term. It refers to a lot of different types of films.
Also, since you've mentioned already First Reformed, there are, apart from several techniques that you've mentioned that you also use in First Reformed, you also decided for shooting it not in widescreen, but in 4:3 Academy format. And maybe you can also say something about the decision like that. And
well, I mean, I decided to do that film after speaking with Pavel Pavlovsky at the National Society of Film Critics Awards dinner. And I had always resisted making or writing such a film, and after that meeting, I thought to myself, I'm going to be 70 next year. It's time to do it. It's time to write that script you swore you would never write. And so I said, I'll make a film like this one. Now, in Ida, it is in that format. It is black and white. There are no pan or tilts. And so I'll just do that. I ended up shooting it in color, but that's where the idea came from. But here's also an interesting anecdote. When you make a rule, like no pan or tilt, one of the benefits of that rule is you get to break it. And so why would you make a rule so that you can break it? So you can make it again. The audience will forget about the rule unless you break it and then make it again. And so in First Reformed, static shot, no pan, no tilt. Then all of a sudden there's a weird camera move, oblique camera move, and then back to the thing, So when I was talking to Pavel, I said, they say this film has no pan or tilts, but there is one pan, there is one tilt. And he said, oh, you mean shots 18 and 36? So he knew very well what he was doing.
And picking up on that, I mean, the establishing of a rule is only interesting in order to break it. You were always very anxious, and also in the lecture right now, in order to make clear that your films up to First Reformed, that you would not see them like in transcendental style cinema, while at the same time we always find in your films these moments that kind of like break with the rule now, not with the rule of slow cinema, but they break with the rule of action cinema. You have, I think, for example, of the empty rooms in American Gigolo that all of a sudden we see and feel for kind of lost, or these moments of dilapidated cinemas in the canyons. So I feel there's still something that is actually also like a continuous movement throughout your film.
Well, yeah, I think you're reading into it. I mean, at some point you're just trying to be interesting. And what's more interesting, So I was just on Facebook, and somebody had just watched Comfort Strangers again. And they put up a question. They said, "Is the opening shot a tribute to Marienbad?" I said, "Of course," but no one had ever. No, that's been 30 years. I'm the first time someone realized that the opening shot was the same one as Marienbad. So you do little interesting things, but that's being interesting and withholding are two different techniques.
And like judging from your personal position, but also like in view of film. I mean, you highlighted this a bit for us for like the tendencies of cinema, but I think it is a crucial question. Like, what will be the future of cinema? Is there still
Well, what do you mean by cinema?
Yeah,
You mean theatrical cinema?
yeah.
Oh, well, there's not going to be much of one. It's pretty much gone already, but it won't disappear. You know, just like rock and roll hasn't disappeared, neither has opera, but they ain't what they used to be. And so you will have a specialized theatrical kind of cinema. You know, event cinema, clubhouse, film club cinema, family cinema, you know, horror cinema, so forth. But people will find their own ways into the media, and most people at this point probably have a better projection system at home than they do in the multiplex. And but I used to think that cinema was going through a period of transition, but I now believe that it has entered, like much of culture, into a period of permanent transition. That we will never come out of this transition. You know, just like every time you open the box of your computer, it's already out of date. By the time you see a movie, you know, the mechanisms of making it, selling it, distributing it have already changed. So that's just the world we live in, the accelerating curve of events.
But what do you think? I mean, before we also talked about that in fact the film like The Canyons, you already like you made that film in view of that it is watched on a computer, not in cinema, and I was wondering, what about transcendental style and certain of those withholding techniques? Because one of the aspects, of course, is that a cinema like this, that what we have here, is also kind of like a machine that helps you to concentrate.
Yeah, well, the captive audience. Yeah. You know, people don't walk out of church because they're bored. They go to church to be bored. So if you go to a cinema to see a certain kind of movie, you've already made a commitment. That's very important. And the filmmaker can exploit that commitment and take his time. He has to be careful, but he can't. So for me, the film I made before First Reformed Dog Eat Dog, which was a completely profane Tarantino-esque bit of blasphemy. It's fine with me you watch that on VOD. It looks great on VOD. This film, First Reformed, I'm very happy that the discussion of the film has begun in the theater, because everyone now who is writing about it in the media and discussing it has seen it in a theater. So that 3 months from now, when it is available on VOD and on Amazon and Netflix, I mean, on iTunes, people will say, oh, let's watch that film that we have to take time to watch. And then that's a lot different than just checking and saying, Ethan Hawke, oh, yeah, let's watch that.
I have like one last question before I would like to open up the discussion, and this is also a more of a theological question, and also maybe I can trigger you into writing a next chapter for your book, since I was wondering. Kierkegaard, the philosopher and theologian, appears in your book, but like only on the side. It is an important figure also, I think, for First Reformed. And there's a very interesting concept. We're quite familiar with that. This idea of the leap of faith. This idea that an act of faith is not something that follows chronologically and logically out of what you already have, but it's kind of like it's an act. It's something that you have to attempt. And I was wondering, is there, because it seems like transcendental style is so much about like meditation. It gets slower, you do less, you take time. But could there also be, and you said there's no such thing as fast transcendental style, but I was nonetheless wondering, is there also an aesthetics of a transcendental leap?
Well, in the book, I call it a decisive moment, where all of a sudden you break the rule. And I mean, you don't break it a little, you bang the rule, you smash the rule. So that at the end of Ida, a movie with all static shots, ends with 2 very, very long tracking shots. And the music comes up and everything changes. And at the end of the film, you have to say, you know, you take him to another place right now, and then he's into the film. In the first Reform, you know, all of a sudden the film ends in this Hitchcockian whirligig of a slow motion kiss, which violates everything the film has been trying to do. And so, and then it abruptly ends. And so you at that point, you as a spectator, you either jump, you know, my heart leaps, or it doesn't. And if you're lucky as a artist, it does.
And with that, I'd like to take a leap into the audience, and I'm wondering if there are questions to be asked. Is there a microphone that's going around?
It's an honor to be here with you. And does it work? Okay. I read in an old interview that you mentioned the first screenplay influenced by Bresson. It's called The Pipeliner or Pipeliner. You wrote it right after your book, Transcendental Style.
Yeah, I usually pretend that script doesn't exist because after that script, I wrote Taxi Driver. And I wrote that script as an exercise in transcendental style. And then when I started trying to think about how to get it made, I realized that we're talking career death here. And, you know, I'm never going to be a filmmaker if I'm going to try to make this as a first film. And so I just put it in the drawer and pretended that it didn't exist. And I'm sure it uses all those same elements that I use in the book. But, of course, it's such a young man's movie, you know. These kind of austerity techniques are not usually the place where a person starts his career. Bresson didn't start here. He started in essentially drawing room comedy, social commentary. It took him, you know, he was in his 40s before he got to this place. So it would have been foolish for me to try to get there so early.
Okay. I just want to add, since I saw yesterday First Reformed, I was so blown away, and the images stayed with me. So I want more of that. So I thought maybe you will rethink and do the old screenplay. Maybe.
Oh, it's in the archive now in Texas. I have to actually find it. I don't know. Maybe I don't. You know, it's much more about. Thank you for the thought.
Yes, I wonder because you, as a director, you wrote several famous screenplays, and now I would like to know, what do you think about how your screenplays were realized by those other directors?
Well, I didn't get into directing because I felt that I was being abused. I was actually quite happy with a number of the adaptations. But I also felt that I was like a half an artist. I thought to myself, if you want to be a writer, actually write words which people read. And if you want to be a filmmaker, then make films that people see. But being a screenwriter is like being a half a person. And so I decided then to try to be a filmmaker. And then I was able to keep writing for others without feeling that same thing. But, an interesting example is Taxi Driver, which Scorsese did in a very exciting, dynamic way. But if you look at that script, it's not that different from First Reformed. It's a younger man's script, but it's not that different. Marty could have technically shot that in the static style. I don't know what would have become of it, and maybe should remake it as a static film.
And in a way, it has these moments. I mean, I'm thinking of Travis when he's at the taxi station, and we have this long pan, which almost like feels like that you're wondering, okay, where is the camera moving to? What is there to see?
Yeah. So I was very fortunate with that one. De Palma and Sidney Pollack and Peter Weir, I would have done things differently, but I didn't feel that, they were bad films and they were bad directors. I didn't feel abused.
Just by the way, I'm talking of Scorsese. I mean, he also did now his last film, Silence. It's kind of also an interesting leap. There's certain similarities also that he said. It took me quite a long time to do this film. It has become a strange kind of hybrid. I know that you have thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I knew that book quite well, and at one point in my career, I tried to steal it from Marty, and because the option had lapsed, and he caught me, and he was furious, and I said, "You're never going to make that film," and he said, "Yes, I am," and he did. But I went to the screening of it. I took my cinematographer of First Reformed, and we watched the film, and afterward we talked, and I said, "This is a perfect example of how to do something half right." Because he knows in his head he's got to restrain himself. But at certain moments he can't, because he's got action scenes and all that running around. And you can see a kind of a talent being torn apart, because intellectually he's trying to be rigorous. But in his core, he's simply an organ grinder at an Italian festival. That's who he is. And so, how does he resist his essence, Whereas at my core, I'm a Protestant kid from Michigan, so I don't have that problem. That's one interesting thing about Silence. Another is that the premise of which it is based changed from the day it was published to the day the film was made. At the time the book was published in the 50s, there was a general acceptance that the missionary projects were a beneficial one, that missionaries were good. We now think of missionaries as the tip of the colonial spear. So the book is predicated on the idea that missionaries are good. But now, when you see the movie, you walk in assuming that missionaries are bad. Well, that's a big shift from an audience point of view. And, I don't think he took that into effect. And the third thing I thought is that you could actually see him debating with himself. Because he had made Last Temptation of Christ, which is about, the Christian sacrifice. Then he had made Kundun, which is about a kind of Eastern acceptance. Now he has these two movies talking to each other in this film. And they're both right. How can you have an argument between the East and the West, and he keeps saying, well, you're right. And so it's kind of frustrating, because you can see him actually trying to take both sides of the argument. And one thing you have to do in a movie or a work of art is just take a stand and take the slings and arrows that come along with that stand. You know, that's just anecdotally, it's just something I was writing on Facebook. Because some people on Facebook are, you know, a number of people want to tell a Harvey Weinstein story. And of course, it's going to be quite bad because it's just going to be more PC propaganda. I said, there's only one Weinstein story that really should be told, and that's the new version of King Lear, where this old deposed man is fighting with sound and fury against his ungrateful daughters. Now that would be a take, and they would come after you for that one. But that is a take worth taking. You know, you just have to sort of take a position and let them come after you. That was a digression.
Thank you. It's just a curiosity, you know. You were mentioning De Sica, Chantal Akerman, Tarkovsky, even Eugene Green. But you, being in Switzerland, you didn't say anything about Godard. Why?
Oh, well, I mean, I was asked this question about late Godard, you know. I don't know quite what late Godard is up to. Obviously he's deeply into a meta cinema, and he's using duration and all of that. But I can't get a handle on what he's doing. There were a couple filmmakers that I kind of skated around in the book. I didn't put Kieslowski in because I couldn't quite get a handle on what he was doing. Whereas Janesco, it's very clear, you know, he's working in this way. Kieslowski, you know, people said, you forgot Kieslowski. I said, no, I just couldn't make up my mind.
Hello. I'm just wondering where you put the work of Terry Malick in the firmament.
I skated around that question.
No, he's in the new book. There's a graph, you know, just like the one I described with the nucleus and the errant electrons and the Tarkovsky ring. Terry is in the ring, and he is moving toward the art gallery rather than toward meditation. He's becoming more and more abstract. You know, that seems to be the way he is leading from narrative, rather than, you know, the documentation or spirituality. But he's definitely inside the ring. But the last couple of films getting closer to it.
But one could also even argue with him that I also sense even on the narrative, so kind of like a that's no longer what you call the decisive moment, but it's kind of like everything starts to flow into one another, and you have a kind of like a pantheistic fantasy, which eventually it's not necessarily the same dead end as slow cinema could move in, but it's kind of like a similar of like no distinctions anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, Stan Brakhage is also in the chart, and he's clearly outside the ring, but it's the same direction that Brakhage is going, into more and more abstraction. And if Malick kept going the way he's going, you know, he would just at some point turn the soundtrack off and just do the jumble of images. I think he realized, you know, the last couple of films that they weren't going to pay him to do that anymore.
I wanted to return to the question of slow cinema, because it seems to me that one of the principle. I mean, and really interesting of the range of filmmakers you're talking about, and obviously know very well. One of the principles seems to be one of a form of negativity, in a way that there's a model of cinema, which is the narrative cinema, which is the commercial cinema, fundamentally. And what it doesn't seem to recognize, perhaps, and I was interested in what you were saying about Chantal Akerman's film, is that there are different subject matters and different cultures, speaking of cinema, and Ozu is a very good example of this. Ozu is not doing something against a model. He's actually making cinema in a different model. And I suppose one of my intriguing reactions to what you're saying is that a lot of slow cinema is actually about talking about different things. In other words, the Chantal Akerman sequence that you describe is actually about housework, for instance. It's not about refusing to deal with, is refusing narrative models, if you like. It's describing something else that we must look at.
Yeah, I mean, that's the approach of slowing things down, and there's a slow food movement too, and there's part in reaction to our whole culture. There's a whole anti-fast movement, and slow cinema is a part of that as well. But Ozu is a good example of what we're talking about. If you look at the arc of his career, he begins out in comedy. He begins out in typically romantic, family, burping kids comedy. And then after World War II, he starts to slow it down and refine it and refine it and refine it. It takes him a while to get there, and it takes him the experience of the war to get there. He didn't make these films as a 20-year-old man. And so that even though he was still in the commercial tradition, he was almost the only one who was slowing things down in that way, who was still, he was known as an exception, even in his lifetime. That there can really be only one Ozu. Only one guy can pull this hat trick off of slowing the movie down so much and still having people, pay to see it. So he was not really working in the great commercial tradition. He was somewhat of an exception. But that sort of proves the point that you can use these techniques to stay within the commercial tradition.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting point, and kind of actually a point of possible criticism that, while at the same time I find it very very understandable to put this, what you call the narrative nucleus, in the center, and then kind of like a movement outwards. One could also, of course, describe like a history of cinema of just like parallel movements of that. At the same time, also different people have different ideas. What is this thing, cinema? So that also makes me wonder. Since you're still so like interested in watching different films, I mean, that's really striking how many things that you watch, you read film theory. Are there other like movements? Not necessarily you could place in your graph, but more something like, is there something around that you came across that you thought, okay, that is interesting. I don't get it. I don't understand how it works, but it's kind of interesting.
Well, I mean, one could write the antithesis book of this. There's a very famous film by Charles Eames called Powers of 10, where he starts inside an atom and goes to the most outer edge of space, and then he goes right back down to the atom again. So you could say, instead of watching the electrons break away, let's watch what happens when narrative starts eating itself when it becomes hyper-narrative. And we're also seeing that process now, where, it's just a flurry of splices. The sort of Tony Scott school, or the video game kind of electricity. And of course, that has a dead end too, which is, a kind of, chaos. So you could say, let's go the other way into narrative. Let's look at what happens when it goes hyper-narrative.
That would be, in fact, something that like in literature, what Rob Crier tried, in the kind of like a strange combination of like nothing happens, but it's like an excess of description.
Yeah. I mean, or pension, Yeah.
Shall we call it a day? No. Yes. One last question.
We have a few more pounds to sweat off here.
I wonder where you would position 2001 by Kubrick.
It is a kind of, obviously it's, benchmark film. And it's, it holds up so incredibly well. And it does go toward mysticism. It goes into a very mysterious place. I guess I never really considered it because you don't see those. He's not using those slowing devices, and but he is, headed toward the mystery, and I think it's a valid point. I just never considered it.
One last question.
But did you consider the Duel film by Spielberg? It came out in '72.
Yeah, well, Duel is the perfection of action. I mean, I remember the first time I saw that, and I've never seen someone use the dynamic camera as effortlessly as he did at the age of 23. So everything I'm talking about is the opposite of Duel.
So I think I'd like to thank you once again for that you've been here. I hope you all buy the book, that you watch First Reformed. I have to say, I had like the last 3 nights I continuously dreamt about you. It was kind of like, it was overwhelming for me to be able to be here, and I think it was also for the audience was fantastic. Thank you very much for that.